The Cumming Global Centre for Pandemic Therapeutics would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we've recorded this podcast series, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and we pay our respects to all elders past, present and emerging. Off Script is brought to you by the Cumming Global Centre for Pandemic Therapeutics, part of the Doherty Institute for Infection and Immunity. I'm Dr. Matt Agnew, your host. While the COVID-19 pandemic might feel like it's behind us, the team here at the Cumming Global Centre for Pandemic Therapeutics is looking straight ahead, at the next pandemic. You might recall the headlines back in mid-2022. A centre dedicated to finding treatments for future pandemics was launched right here in Melbourne, backed by the largest donation ever made to Australian medical research from philanthropist Jeff Cumming, along with support from the Victorian Government. The Cumming Global Centre for Pandemic Therapeutics is part of the Doherty Institute for Infection and Immunity and sits within Melbourne's burgeoning biomedical precinct. This is a cracking area of Australia's medical research agenda, and in this series, we'll tell the story of Australia's next big medical breakthrough, pandemic therapeutics. But Matt, what is a therapeutic? I hear you asking. A therapeutic treats an illness, and in some cases, might help prevent it too. Therapeutics are well established in treating chronic diseases like HIV, but they're not well developed when it comes to other pandemics. That's about to change. In this series, you might hear therapeutics referred to as drugs, antivirals, medicines or treatments interchangeably, but you know what we mean. To look ahead to the next pandemic, we first need to look backwards at the one missing piece in our national response to COVID-19, and that missing piece was therapeutics. You're about to hear from Professor Sharon Lewin, an internationally renowned scientist best known for her pioneering work on HIV. She's the director of the Doherty Institute for Infection and Immunity, co-chair of the National COVID-19 Health and Research Advisory Committee, and now also the director of the Cumming Global Centre for Pandemic Therapeutics.
Hi.
Hi Sharon, how are you doing?
I'm well, how are you?
I'm well. How have you been? How's your morning been?
Yeah, good. I'm in Germany. It's,
Okay.
in Bonn, and it's going to be 37 today.
Oof. Okay, yeah. Right, that's...
I mean, for Australia, it's no big deal, but in Germany, yeah, they're not really quite used to it. So most places are not air-conditioned. It's really interesting, yeah.
Sharon, thank you for joining me. We're going to travel back in time a little bit, back to early 2020. The COVID-19 pandemic was just beginning to unfold in Australia. The Doherty Institute made history as the first lab to grow SARS-CoV-2, the virus that caused COVID-19, outside of China and the first to share it with the world. I've heard that when that breakthrough happened in January 2020, you were hiking in Patagonia. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Yes. And you got a call from your colleagues in Melbourne, and the Institute had made the call to release the virus to collaborators globally. So what prompted that decision? The releasing of the virus, not the Patagonia hike.
Patagonia hike was my husband's 60th birthday, but I do want me to tell everyone. Everyone knows that. Yeah, it was a very interesting time, actually, because events were unfolding already in middle January before I left. I can remember it exactly. It was January the 12th. We started hearing about it, and January the 18th was when I began thinking this is going to be big. But anyway, I planned the trip and put a few things in place before I left. And then, of course, everything rapidly changed in that last few weeks of January. And in fact, when the then deputy director of the Doherty rang me, Mike Catton, to tell me that it was his laboratory actually that had grown the virus and decided to share it with the rest of the world. My response, and I have said this openly, was actually, why don't we just wait for a week or two and fully characterize the virus, publish that, and then release it. And I was thinking more like an academic, and Mike, who was running a public health lab, was thinking like a public health position, which he had the right response 100%. And he said to me, you know what, I don't agree, and we need to release the virus. So I just trusted him. But good on him. He knew what the right thing was to do, and it was definitely the right decision, because at that time in the pandemic, literally days mattered, and by people getting their hands on that virus earlier, it meant they could validate their diagnostics better. They could start getting to work on new treatments and vaccines, and the whole thing gets more accelerated. And to hang on to it for a few weeks would have absolutely not been the right thing to do. So, Mike had made that decision, and he was 100% right.
Yeah, I think that's having worked in scientific research. It's kind of the approach is wait, let's get this done, let's research, let's characterize, let's do our own publication and assessment before we do that. But yeah, you're right. It's a very different. Very different game when it's something to do with public health. And so we move forward to mid-2021, where the rollout of the COVID-19 vaccines began in Australia, triggering the largest vaccination campaign in our history. But antiviral drugs, and actually, before I dive into this, can you give us a sort of brief summary or definition of what are therapeutics?
To keep it simple, therapeutics are simply drugs that you use once you get the virus. So a vaccine prevents you getting the virus and also can prevent you from getting sick from the virus, for sure. That's how our vaccines for COVID work. But once you actually get the virus, the chances of you going on to become very sick can be changed by a therapeutic, or usually an antiviral drug at that stage. And once you're sick, we also use therapeutics to make you better. So therapeutics are just literally drugs to stop you getting sick or drugs to treat you once you get sick. And in an infection like SARS-CoV-2, we can use drugs to target the virus. And that's probably the best option, because if we can stop the virus in its tracks, then we can stop the downstream effects of the virus in making you sick. But if it's too late for antivirals, then we still have to get treatment to get you better quicker and really stop deaths. At the beginning, that was to stop deaths. Yeah, so there's different therapeutics you'd use at different stages of the disease. And therapeutics can be used primarily to stop you from, once you're infected, getting sick. And then once you're sick, stop you going to hospital or stop you from dying. That's really where we use them.
Okay, so vaccines are very preventative and therapeutics are more reactive, I guess, but it also sounds like there are instances where it can be used preventatively as well. Is that kind of a fair assessment?
Yeah, I mean, to put it a bit more simply, vaccines are injections to boost your immune system to stop you getting infected, and therapeutics are drugs, tablets or injections that stop you from going from being infected to being unwell, or being from unwell to into hospital or to dying. Now, just to slightly complicate things, therapeutics or drugs can be used to stop you even getting infected. For HIV, we have no vaccine, but the entire pandemic has been turned around by having good therapeutics. In this case, they are antivirals. When you treat someone who has HIV, the virus disappears from their blood. They're not cured, but they then become well and live a normal, healthy life. But interestingly, with HIV, if you don't have HIV, you can take an antiviral drug and it stops you from becoming infected. Now, that's a very expensive way to prevent infection. But if you don't have a vaccine in HIV, that's been tremendously helpful. So ideally, when we develop drugs, keep it simple, drugs are injections to treat people. It's usually once they are infected. However, in the event that you never had that you couldn't get a vaccine for an infectious disease, and that happens. It's not common, but it does happen. HIV is a great example. 40 years of work on an HIV vaccine, billions and billions of dollars. Great science, but still no vaccine. You actually can use these therapeutics or antivirals or tablets and injections to prevent you getting infected.
Right. Okay. No, that's I mean, a lot of the discussion we've talked about is almost that more reductive approach of boosting immune system versus treating once you've caught the disease or virus. Whereas this is really, really interesting to hear as well. It can be used preventatively, and HIV is the quintessential example from the sounds of that.
Exactly. And it's important distinction to make that in therapeutics, in drugs, tablets or injections that you get once you're infected, we can have tablets or injections that just target the virus, that actually stop the virus from replicating and then stop you from getting sick. Or we can have therapeutics that actually target the dysfunctional response to the virus and stop the downstream effects. But really what we want to do in the Cumming Centre is very much focused on tackling the virus, because that's essentially tackling it at its source before it can go on to cause trouble.
Yep. Okay, so we've got the Now, a good high-level understanding of therapeutics. I'll dive back into that question I was getting through the mid-2021, the largest vaccination campaign rollout in our history. Antiviral drugs or therapeutics were largely unavailable for COVID-19. So, as you said, that's something that's being looked into, and I imagine something that is really important when it comes to being prepared for the next pandemic. So can you explain or give us an idea of what therapeutics might look like as it pertains to the next pandemic we want to be prepared for?
Yeah, before I hop into that, I'll just step back a little bit. We did have treatments or therapeutics in early 2021. We had treatments that stopped you dying, essentially, so that if you landed in hospital by that stage, it had been worked out that you could give a drug, which was a steroid, to dampen your immune system. And if you got a steroid, once you're in hospital, it stopped you from dying by about 30% reduction in death. So that was a really important advance. But it was stopping the downstream effects of the virus. So that was a very important development. We got that quite early. And we also developed some therapeutics that targeted the virus. These were not tablets, these were injections, and they were something called antibodies. Antibodies actually had really not been used widely for viruses until COVID-19. And they worked initially, but the problem was the virus kept on escaping the antibodies. The antibodies had to be given as injections, so they were quite difficult to administer. We did not have a simple oral tablet that targeted the virus like we have for HIV. And that would have been very helpful for a number of reasons. Because if you have an oral tablet that, like we have for HIV, that has few side effects and preferably cheap, if you just got a positive test, you could go onto the tablet and stop you from getting sick. And that capability we did not have until really late 2022. And that's what we want to do better in for the next pandemic. Have access preferably to tablets, because once it's injections, it gets complicated. You've got to get to a healthcare facility. It's a lot more expensive, very difficult to roll out, especially in low middle income countries. So the ideal would be to have a tablet that is not very few side effects, because you're treating people that are quite well. I mean, you just had a positive, rat test, and then you go onto your tablet to stop you getting sick. You want a tablet that's not got very many side effects, preferably that's cheap, preferably that's oral, and preferably that directly targets the virus and stops it from ever causing any damage down the track. So ideally, when we come to a pandemic, we have two options. We have a cupboard full of potential antiviral drugs that we know work against a wide range of viruses or a wide range of families of viruses, and we can pull these drugs that have already been shown to be safe and see if they work for this new virus. That's one option, and many people in the world are working on that, building our kind of supplies of potentially what we call broad spectrum antiviral drugs that work against lots of viruses or lots of families of viruses. But you might not be able, there's a chance we might not predict that next virus. It could be a family of viruses that we've never thought about before. And so what do we do in a case like that? We've got nothing in the cupboard that's going to work because a brand new family of viruses. So the other approach is to work on technologies that can rapidly deliver you a new therapeutic, even if it's a new virus. And that's really the focus of the Cumming Centre, trying to use different technologies that can get you a therapeutic for a new virus at speed. And the current approaches we use just to develop antiviral drugs. I'll just talk about antiviral drugs now, not the drugs that stop you from dying once you're in hospital, like steroids, but the antiviral drugs. We use technologies that were actually developed for HIV. The first virus that we really got good antivirals for was HIV, and subsequently hepatitis B, and subsequently hepatitis C. They're like the pin-up viruses of the virus world, where we've got really good tablets that work very effectively at stopping the virus from replicating. But the technologies that we use to develop those antivirals, they were really developed back in the 70s, 80s. So we're trying to get newer technologies that give us treatments at speed. And the technologies that we use to develop HIV drugs, they all take quite a bit of time, because every drug that you're searching for a drug that's active, let's use the example of HIV, and it's very specific for HIV. So you've got a novel compound. The novel compound has to be proven to be safe, put into phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 studies. That all takes a lot of time. So we think maybe we can do something a bit smarter and therefore quicker.
We'll jump in back again to our going back in time and looking how the rollout and everything went. I guess, and you mentioned there was some therapeutics that were developed in response to people contracting COVID-19, and as you said, that drop in 30% of preventing deaths in the hospital. But in, I guess, a broader sense, why did the discovery of antiviral therapeutics lag behind the rest of the pandemic response? Not just here in Australia, but globally as well. Was there a driving force there, or was it just tied in with the complexity of developing therapeutics?
I think there are two reasons. First of all, that an area that had not had a lot of investment as opposed to vaccines. There was a principle developed in around 2017, 2018 to something called platform technologies for vaccines. It was largely driven by an organisation called CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, that were funding big amounts of money to people that had vaccine platforms that could rapidly adapt to a new pathogen, which they call pathogen X. So CEPI were funding groups around the world, including a group here in Australia, at University of Queensland, for a great technology that they might be working on for a known virus now. But to get investment from CEPI, you had to prove that you could adapt your technology to a novel pathogen at speed. And we actually did some formal evaluations of the amount of money that was invested in new vaccine technologies by about October 2021 compared to therapeutic technologies. And we came up with a figure of about $190 billion for vaccines and $7 billion for therapeutics. So much more money had gone into this idea that we could get an unknown pathogen X, and we had to be ready with a vaccine. But that thinking wasn't really widespread for therapeutics. And then I think it's just the technologies. It just takes longer. The current way we develop antiviral drugs takes longer because you've got a single molecule for a single virus, and you have to go through all those steps, which were harder to speed up. Having said that, we did have a type of therapeutic that I mentioned earlier, which did come quite quickly, and that was antibodies. Antibodies basically take advantage of some people make very good immune response to a virus, meaning they make good antibodies, and you can actually pull out those antibodies and create a sort of a way of making them in the laboratory, make them to very large amounts, and then you can give them to people as treatments. And a lot of work has been done on synthesizing these novel treatments, antibodies, which were done for HIV. But a bit had been done for Ebola, a bit for something called RSV, but not at the scale and the speed that happened in COVID. And in fact, we had an antibody. You might remember President Trump received an antibody from Regeneron in late 2020. And so we did have antibodies in the middle of 2020, but they were expensive. They were complex to give. The virus kept on escaping from the antibodies. So over time, there were 3 or 4 antibodies that were licensed over that time, but the virus kept on escaping them. So I think we can do better with antibodies, make them cheaper, maybe easier to deliver, more robust against, resistance. But it was the tablet like Paxlovid, which wasn't a great drug anyway, because it had quite a few side effects. It interacted with other drugs. Many GPs didn't feel comfortable prescribing it because of those drug interactions. It was expensive. It never really got into low and middle income countries. That sort of antiviral therapeutic, that took us a lot longer, because you need a drug like that to really get the benefit at scale from a therapeutic. That took 2 years. Yeah.
So if we had access to that sort of antiviral therapeutic much earlier on, how a really effective therapeutic, how might that, how might our response to the COVID-19 pandemic have looked?
Oh, I think it could have looked very, very different. And in fact, we had done some modelling on millions of lives saved by access to an antiviral for a few reasons. First of all, it can sort of hold the fort, so to speak, while your vaccine's being developed. And remember, when you have a vaccine, it takes a few weeks to build up your immune response to the vaccine. You've got to have 2, maybe 3 shots. It takes a few weeks, sometimes months. So it can fill in that gap while you're developing the vaccine, administering it, and waiting for people to develop their response to the vaccine. You still need antivirals even with an effective vaccine, because the people that got infected where the vaccine didn't work and had a high risk of going on to disease, they still need antiviral drugs. So it stops illness. And it's incredibly important if you can't develop a vaccine. And actually, in the early days of COVID, there are many experts out there saying, I'm not so sure we'll develop the coronavirus vaccine. We've never had a coronavirus vaccine. We've had some for poultry, but that wasn't perfect. It could overactivate the immune system. So we do, as a global community, have to also think about the potential of a outbreak from a virus or pathogen that we can't develop a vaccine for. So it's sort of like the second level of the fire department. It's an insurance backup policy as well.
Right. It sounds like the toolbox approach where you have many different tools available, and therapeutics is a critically important one to, I guess, be even more prepared for the next pandemic. Let's summarise what we've just heard. Australia staged a mammoth response to COVID-19 and was among the best in the world at managing the outbreak. But there was one thing missing from our response, and that was pandemic therapeutics. But this gap wasn't just a local issue. Around the world, countries scrambled to find tools to treat people after they got sick, and many came up short. That's where the global picture becomes important, because our national story is part of a much larger pattern. Sir Jeremy Farrar is one of the best-known British medical researchers, and now Chief Scientist at the World Health Organization, a role he has held since 2023. He was previously Director of the Wellcome Trust, a charitable foundation dedicated to support scientific research into urgent global health challenges, and he's a former member of the UK government's Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies. Basically, Sir Jeremy has a lot of influence in global health. Unfortunately, Jeremy and I couldn't line up our schedules for a chat, so we sat down with our producer and global health specialist, Rachel.
Sir Jeremy Farrar, thank you so much for speaking with me.
Pleasure.
Now, you published a book, Spike, in July 2021, which provides your account of how the COVID-19 pandemic unfolded in the UK. And in that book, you speak about the need for a comprehensive pandemic response, including vaccines, PPE, diagnostics, and therapeutics. Let's start there. Why do you think antiviral therapeutics lagged so far behind in COVID-19, both in the UK and globally?
Yeah, thanks very much. So I'm delighted you read the book. You must be the second person that read it. I would add, as well as that long list, the other area that I think is crucial is around social and behavioural understanding of how individuals respond to things. It's not just all about medicalisation, and I think behaviour and social aspects are also critical. On the therapeutic side, it isn't just COVID that this is true of. In fact, if you look across all of the acute viral infections, our drug options are very limited. If we look at influenza, flu, for instance, we do have drugs for flu, but we all appreciate they're not great. The therapeutic for acute viral infections has lagged behind. Of course, it's difficult. Of course, making progress in it has proved extremely difficult for many, many years. But it's critical that we do develop that area. We don't know that we'll have a vaccine for the next pandemic. We still obviously don't have a vaccine for HIV. And we've been managed to change the nature of that HIV epidemic by the use of therapeutics. So therapeutics are really critical, and they've lagged behind.
If we just dig into that point a bit more, though, have they lagged behind because there's been a consistent underinvestment in the medical research required to develop them?
Yeah, it is, of course, and where you've had, historically, where you've had huge investment, and I'll come back again, for instance, to HIV, where it was clear in the 1980s, 90s that a vaccine was going to be extraordinarily difficult, may not even be possible, that therapeutics was going to be. There was a massive investment in therapeutics for HIV and incredible successes with the development of drugs. We have not had that same investment in other viral infections, other than maybe hepatitis C. But for the acute viral infections, influenza, dengue, Japanese encephalitis, yellow fever, whatever you want to name, it's been much harder. There has been progress, though, with therapeutics in other areas where there are big demand and where there's, frankly, diseases of the rich world, and the investment has gone into that. The development of drugs for RSV, antibody therapies for RSV now has progressed remarkably. So I think it is possible. And then, of course, when you have drugs, you then have to change your health system for how they're used. And because most drugs for acute viral infections work best early after infection, then you need to have a health system that can deliver those drugs when people need them and they're effective. And that would need a transition in health systems, all of which is possible, but we're not there yet.
No, we're not there yet, but it does look like we're heading in the right direction. But who's responsible for pushing the needle on this? Is it academia? Is it philanthropists who should be funding this kind of quite exploratory, high-risk research into antiviral therapeutics?
So I think the answer to this comes back to what is the role of government. And frankly, this is, given the risk that the world faces, for instance, for a flu pandemic, or another acute viral infection pandemic for which a vaccine would be difficult. This is about national resilience, national security, protection of people's lives, of course, and the global economy. So ultimately, governments need to push this through their government funding of science, and then the incentives governments provide to industry in order to develop those academic work pull it through into drugs. So I think it's a combination of government and, of course, industry working together in order to say this is an issue of such national and global importance that we need to push this. But it needs both. Philanthropy's role, in my view, is not to do what government should do. Philanthropy's role is to complement that work, but do things that governments struggle with, which includes taking high risk. Yes, I agree with that. And catalyzing things. But ultimately, philanthropy is not big enough scale-wise to take on this sort of thing. It can catalyze, it can take bigger risk, it can do things that government struggles to do. But in the end, it comes back to a combination of public funding and industrial pull-through mostly from academia.
Mm. And you are very well placed to make that comment, having formerly led the Wellcome Trust. And as you know, here in Australia, the Cumming Global Centre for Pandemic Therapeutics was jointly funded by the Victorian state government and through a very generous donation from a philanthropist. Are there similar initiatives emerging in the UK?
Yeah, there are. In fact, there are similar initiatives emerging all over. The centre in Victoria is fantastic. I agree with you, and the head of it, Sharon, is a fantastic scientist, and it's a brilliant setup. And they are linked now. And Sharon has been involved in this, and as have I, in trying to create a global network of people working on the academic and public sector funded areas, including in Europe, in Japan, in Singapore, in South Africa, in the United States, in Canada, UK as well, and to try and bring these groups together, because we also appreciate there's never going to be enough money. And it's critical that there is a network of scientists working around the world who are sharing that information so that not everybody's competing on a small number of things, but there's a sort of more strategic approach to say, we will do this piece of work in Melbourne, and people in Singapore will do that. People in France or Germany or UK or Canada or America will do other bits, and that there'll be a free flow of information. And in my new role here now, actually at WHO is playing a role not to do that work, but to convene those groups, to bring them together in a series of networks, which I think is a really positive move forward.
And of course, for listeners, you're now Assistant Director General in the Division of Health Promotion, Disease Prevention and Control at the WHO, and were previously the Chief Scientist. I imagine there was a lot of excitement over the last few weeks about the pandemic accord.
Yeah, I mean, the world, wherever you look in the world, it's sometimes hard to pick up a newspaper or look at the news at the moment, just because it is very depressing with war everywhere and conflict and geopolitics and fragmentation and the rest of it. But I do think the agreement in May of the pandemic accord, albeit it has to go now through national governments for ratification, but does demonstrate that actually the world still does want to come together. And 194 countries came together in May and said, despite all our differences and the arguments around sharing of pathogens and intellectual property and sharing the benefits of sharing information and data, we will agree to this pandemic accord. And I think, the world still does need convening to bring together countries, even if they disagree on some things, to agree on other issues which are of, no individual country can address on their own. So amongst a very dark world at the moment, with shadows everywhere and clouds, really, really difficult to understand where the world is at the moment, I think that was a really bright point.
Yeah, I really agree. And as you say in your book, the next pandemic isn't an if, but a when. So from your perspective, what do we need to do to ensure that antiviral therapeutics are in people's hands when the next pandemic hits?
What you have before a pandemic hits really is what's critical. Yeah, if you don't have trust amongst your society at a reasonably high level when the pandemic hits, then when a tension happens like a pandemic, then you can't build trust in a pandemic. It's the same with vaccines. It's the same with therapeutics. It's the same with the ability to make reasonable policy decisions on the basis of evidence. If you have systems that work before a pandemic, you will probably come out through the pandemic better. So the critical element for me, whether we're talking about the development of drugs or we're talking about trust in society or we're talking about future vaccine development, whatever we're talking about, preparing for a crisis is best done by making sure that you have things in place that deal with every issue, every Monday, every Tuesday, that really matter to people. And so my plea would not be to think, well, we'll deal with this when the pandemic comes, but what do we need to have now that actually addresses day-to-day health issues, which can then be leveraged and used when it comes to pandemic? I mean, take the vaccines for COVID-19. They were developed off the back of science that had gone back 20, 30, 40 years. The manufacturing capacity wasn't built in the pandemic. It was leveraged off existing manufacturing capacity. And if you look around countries of the world, those countries that had higher trust in institutions, in government, in science, indeed, actually generally performed better during the pandemic. So I think the key is to appreciate that a pandemic, when it comes, as it inevitably will be defined by what you have before the pandemic. And we cannot wait for the next pandemic in order to develop the next drugs that will address the pandemic.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is pandemic preparedness is key, and it's very hard.
Well,
drug.
Yeah, in my view, it is about pandemic preparedness, but it's about pandemic preparedness that is providing value and utility to societies every Monday and every Tuesday, and then is used for the pandemic, rather than allocating probably limited resources to a future pandemic, which may or may not come next year, 20 years from now, 5 years from whatever it might be, and to actually focus on what's needed every day, and with a view to that longer term thinking about what would we leverage if there were an existential crisis such as a future pandemic. So it's slightly changing a narrative from preparing for a pandemic to how can we put our systems in place that work every Monday and every Tuesday and know that they can then be leveraged in a pandemic.
That's a really important distinction, because it brings to mind all the ways that we can reduce burdens on our hospital systems.
One of the lessons from being involved many years ago during 2014 and 15 through the Ebola crisis in West Africa was many people at the time in West Africa said, why are you coming to us now about Ebola when you didn't care much last month when my daughter had a mental health issue, or my father had a cancer, or where were you when we needed you before? And the only way we're going to build trust in what you're doing now for Ebola is if you start to invest in what we need all the time. And so I do think reframing this as this will help our health systems be more resilient when a crisis then hits is the only way. It's actually the only way I think governments are going to support it ultimately, because most governments inevitably are quite short-sighted in terms of have to deal with so many crises today, tomorrow, and the next day, that if things are not providing utility all the time, it's difficult to justify them in constrained budgets. So build systems that work all the time and then leverage them when you have a crisis.
Yeah, I like that reframe a lot. And what do you see as the role of the WHO in supporting, well, health system strengthening generally, but more specifically the development of therapeutics?
Well, I think the WHO, I mean, it's why I came here 2 years ago. I mean, at the end of the day, you have 194 countries with health systems who are focused mostly on delivering that at a domestic level. But then there are many things which are shared across countries, across borders, across regions, whether it be climate change and health, whether it be how to deal with mental health issues in young or senior people, whether it be pandemics or antimicrobial resistance or the spread of infections or where mosquitoes fly with climate change, or how we develop our urbanization in cities, or how we deal with demographic shifts. So these are all domestic issues, but they're shared experiences across countries and across regions. And my view is the WHO's as the unique global agency that brings all of those countries together, 194 of them, in a convening when the world is in danger of falling apart in terms of shared agendas. The WHO is one of those few places that can bring people together to have a good debate, some disagreements, yes, but in the end, as well as the pandemic accord, you can find consensus and agreement to move forward, share pathogens, and share the benefits of sharing those pathogens. And then in a fractured world, those sorts of convening power becomes ever more important. And then in terms of therapeutics, I think what WHO is doing through the R&D blueprint here is to say to that fantastic new center in Melbourne, how can you now work with Singapore, Japan, Korea, Europe, South Africa, Nigeria, United States, Brazil, Canada, Europe, UK, wherever they are, to make sure that you're working collaboratively across borders scientifically in order to maximize what we may be able to do as a world. And that's very powerful. And if WHO can play a small role in helping countries work together across borders where they wouldn't naturally do in other areas, then I think it's got an absolutely critical role.
Yeah. And if there's one thing we hear consistently in the Cumming Global Centre for Pandemic Therapeutics, it's the importance of global collaboration. And every scientist in the centre emphasises the importance of those global linkages.
Yeah, at a time when, I'm not too... I refuse to be overly pessimistic, but if you look at the world at the moment, it looks really difficult. And how are we going to emerge from this? And I think in that, science as well as culture can play an absolutely critical role, because on the whole, scientists around the world do want to collaborate across borders and just want to try and address questions that none of us as scientists can individually question. So I think science has got a role in developing therapeutics for the next pandemic or developing cancer therapies for tomorrow. But it's also got a role, an even bigger role, in bringing countries of the world together in a way that at the moment, politics seems it's challenging to do that. So science has a role in science. I think it's also got a role in showing that the world can work together in a better way.
Yeah, and I think you've alluded to it there, but we have recently seen the effects of one country withdrawing from global health efforts and the ripple effect that can have. And I think you've emphasised there the real importance of global collaboration ahead of the next pandemic.
Yeah, global collaboration brings benefits all the time. And yes, at the moment, the United States has taken a view that it will withdraw in January 2026 from the World Health Organization and other UN bodies, which is deeply regrettable. And, obviously everybody hopes that they will reconsider that. But global collaboration has to go on. And this network of development of drugs and the science behind it, including the new centre in Melbourne, is a way of demonstrating that despite the politics of the world at the moment, science can still work across borders. And I think that is a really important message.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. To finish, let's flash forward 10, 20 years from now. You've written a sequel to Spike. The next pandemic has been and gone. What does the sequel say about antiviral therapeutics?
I actually think of writing a different sequel of a novel of how UN agencies work in the system. But on the sequel to Spike, sincerely hope I do it with my co-author, Anne Genjani, who was a brilliant co-author to the book. I think it would be that we would have a much more holistic, much more broader approach to how we deal with pandemics. Number one, the epidemics that we've witnessed over the last 25 years and the pandemics of the future are the symptoms of much broader societal things going on. Climate change, biodiversity loss, urbanization, trade and travel, all features of the 21st century. And so each epidemic we see as a discrete episode. They're not. They're happening because of these drivers happening, climate change, diversity, and all urbanization, all of those things, the wildlife trade. These are happening, and they're the key drivers. If we don't address those drivers, then we will have more epidemics and pandemics. It's true. If and when, it is a when, we have disruptive regional epidemics or future pandemics, my hope is that we don't see it as the answer is just a magic bullet of X, Y, a vaccine, say, important as vaccines are, but that we see it as a total approach, which does include understanding how people behave and how they respond to advice and evidence and science. It includes diagnostics, includes therapeutics, and includes vaccines. We can only really make sure that we are protected against future pandemics, I think, by taking that much more integrated, broad approach.
Yep. Thank you so much, Sir Jeremy Fryer. We appreciate your time.
Yeah, pleasure.
We need pandemic therapeutics ready before the next pandemic hits. But why are we talking about this now? What are the stakes? If COVID-19 taught us anything, it's that pandemics don't wait until we're ready. Just this year, a new strain of avian flu raised alarm bells globally. Modelling from the World Health Organization suggests we could face another major pandemic within the next decade, or potentially even sooner. Experts warn that climate change, urbanisation, and global travel are only accelerating our risk. The time to invest in pandemic therapeutics isn't when the next outbreak begins. It's right now, in this window between crises, when we still have time to act. Easier said than done, but fortunately for you and I, there's a dedicated team here at the Cumming Global Centre working to do exactly that. In episode 2, we'll dive into Australia's incredible medical research capability and our moonshot goal to develop pandemic therapeutics, not just for us, but for the whole world. This might be the most interesting podcast series you'll hear all year, so don't miss an episode.